In December of 1799, George Washington woke with a sore throat. Over the next 12 hours, 3 of the finest physicians in America did everything their training demanded. They bled him 4 times, draining close to half the blood in his body. They blistered his skin, purged his bowels, and made him gag on a mixture of molasses and butter. By nightfall, he was dead, killed not by the infection in his throat, but by the men trying to save him. This is the origin of the doctor, the healer whose cure was often the thing that killed you. So, how did the most trusted figure in modern life, the person you hand your body to without a second thought, spend most of history making the sick sicker? Because that is the strange truth sitting at the center of this story. For roughly 2,000 years, the doctor was a man of enormous authority and almost no power to cure. He could set a broken bone, lance a boil, stitch a wound, and sit with the dying, and beyond that, his best treatments ranged from useless to lethal. And yet people obeyed him, paid him, and revered him the entire time. The history of the doctor is not really the history of healing. It is the history of authority, of who was allowed to stand at the bedside and be believed, long before anyone could prove that standing there did any good at all. Start with the word itself, because it gives the whole game away. Doctor does not come from any root that means to heal, or to cure, or to make well. It comes from the Latin docere, which means to teach. A doctor was a learned man, a teacher, someone with a title and a book, and the medical doctor was simply one kind of scholar among many. That is why we still speak of a doctor of philosophy or a doctor of law. The healing was almost incidental. What the title certified was, not that this man could fix your body, but that he had studied. Hold on to that, because it explains something that will run through this entire story. For most of history, the doctor's power came from what he knew, or claimed to know, not from what he could actually do. The other 2 words in the trade are just as revealing. Physician comes from the Greek physis, meaning nature. So a physician was a student of the natural world, a theorist of the body. Surgeon comes from the Greek chirurgia, which literally means work done with the hands, from chir, the hand, and ergon, work. And there, in the language itself, is the great divide that would define medicine for 1,000 years. The physician was the man of the mind, the theorist who never touched you. The surgeon was the man of the hands, who cut, sawed, and bled, and was looked down on for it. Keep that split in mind, because the story of the doctor is largely the story of those 2 figures, one respectable and useless, one despised and occasionally life-saving, slowly, painfully, merging into a single person. The healer is older than any civilization that wrote his name down. In the skulls of Neolithic people, dug from graves thousands of years old, we find neat holes drilled straight through the bone, a practice called trepanation, done with sharpened flint while the patient was alive. Astonishingly, many of these skulls show signs of healing around the hole, which means the patient survived, sometimes for years. We do not fully know why it was done, perhaps to release headaches, seizures, or the spirits people believe caused them. But it tells you the impulse to cut into the body in the name of healing is as old as humanity itself, older than farming, older than writing. The doctor, in some form, has always been with us. By the time of the first great civilizations, the healer had a name and a reputation. In ancient Egypt, physicians were specialists, some for the eyes, some for the teeth, some for the belly, and the most famous of them, a man named Imhotep who lived around 2,600 years before Christ, was so revered that centuries later he was worshipped as a god of medicine. A surviving Egyptian text we call the Edwin Smith Papyrus reads almost like a modern surgical manual, describing wounds and fractures with cool, careful observation. In Mesopotamia, the healer worked under harder terms. The Code of Hammurabi, written nearly 4,000 years ago, set the surgeon's fee in law and also his punishment. If he saved a nobleman with his bronze knife, he was paid handsomely, but if the patient died under that knife, the surgeon could have his own hand cut off. From the very beginning, the healer's reward and his risk were written side by side. Then came the Greeks, and with them, the idea that would rule and ruin medicine for the next 2,000 years. Around 400 years before Christ, on the island of Kos, a physician named Hippocrates pulled medicine away from priests and temples and insisted that disease had natural causes, not divine ones. That was a genuine revolution, and we honor it still every time a new doctor swears a version of the Hippocratic Oath. But Hippocrates and those who followed him also gave us a theory, and the theory was catastrophically wrong. They taught that the body was ruled by 4 fluids, 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was their balance, sickness was their imbalance, and the doctor's job was to restore the balance by removing whatever there was too much of. If that sounds harmless, consider what it meant in practice. It meant that for 2 millennia, the standard response to illness was to drain fluid out of the patient, most often by opening a vein and letting the blood run. The man who carved that theory into stone was a Greek physician working in Rome named Galen in the 2nd century after Christ. Galen was brilliant, tireless, and staggeringly influential, the personal doctor to gladiators and then to emperors. He dissected animals, pigs, and apes because Roman law forbade the cutting of human corpses, and from those animal bodies he built a complete map of human anatomy. The trouble is that a pig is not a person, and so his map was riddled with errors. But Galen wrote them down with such confidence and in such volume that his word became medical law. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. Galen's mistakes were not corrected for roughly 1,400 years. For 14 centuries, to question Galen was to question the foundation of medicine itself, and generations of doctors bled their patients white because a Roman had studied the insides of apes and been believed a little too well. When Rome fell, much of that knowledge drifted out of Western Europe and was kept alive elsewhere, above all in the Islamic world. In the great cities of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars translated the Greek texts, preserved them, and pushed them forward. A Persian physician named Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote a vast medical encyclopedia called the Canon of Medicine around the year 1000, and it became the standard textbook in European universities for another 600 years. A surgeon named Al-Zarawi described operations and invented instruments still recognizable today. For centuries, the most advanced medicine on earth was practiced not in Paris or Rome, but in Damascus and Baghdad, while much of Europe made do with prayer, folk remedies, and the local wise woman. When medicine came back to Europe, it came back as a subject for gentlemen, and that is where the doctor, as we half recognize him, begins to take shape. In the new medieval universities, at Salerno, Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, a man could study medicine the way he studied theology, or law, in Latin, from the books of Galen and Avicenna, arguing fine points of theory in the lecture hall. He emerged a physician, a learned gentleman, and he would no more touch a patient's wound than a professor would dig a ditch. He observed, he theorized, he prescribed, and he charged well for it. Beneath him, doing the actual physical work of medicine, were 2 lower orders: the apothecary, who mixed and sold the drugs, and the surgeon who cut. And the surgeon, more often than not, was also the man who cut your hair. This is one of the strangest facts in the whole history of the profession, and it hides in plain sight on almost every street. The barber and the surgeon were, for centuries, the same man. The barber already kept sharp blades and a steady hand, already worked in blood, already had a shop the public walked into, so it was the barber who pulled teeth, lanced boils, set bones, and opened veins to let blood. He was called a barber surgeon, and in 1540, King Henry VIII of England formally joined them into a single guild, the Company of Barber Surgeons of London. And that spinning red and white pole you still see outside a barber shop is not decoration. The red is blood, the white is the bandage, and the pole is the staff the patient gripped to swell the veins in his arm while he was bled. The most ordinary sight on the high street is a monument to a time when the man who trimmed your beard also sawed off your leg. You have to sit with what medicine actually felt like in those centuries, because we have softened it in our minds. If you fell ill, the physician would study your urine, sometimes taste it, check your pulse, consult the position of the stars, and pronounce which humor was out of balance. Then the treatment began. He would bleed you, opening a vein or setting leeches to your skin to draw the blood out by the pint. He would purge you with drugs that emptied your bowels and made you vomit on the theory that the illness had to come out. He would blister you, raising raw sores on your skin to draw the sickness to the surface. This was not fringe medicine or quackery. This was the best, most respectable, most expensive care that money could buy, delivered by the finest physicians in the world, and it is almost exactly what killed George Washington on that December night. The richer you were, the more of it you got, and the more of it you got, the more dangerous your illness became. When plague swept through, the theater of medicine reached its eeriest form in the Plague Doctor. In the outbreaks that ravaged Europe, some cities hired physicians specifically to attend the sick and dying, and by the 17th century a distinctive costume appeared. A long waxed coat, gloves, a wide hat, a wooden cane to touch patients without using the hands, and that infamous mask with a long, curved beak. The beak was not for show. It was stuffed with dried flowers, herbs, and spices because doctors believed the plague spread through foul-smelling air, a theory called miasma, and that sweet scents could hold the poison off. They were completely wrong about the cause and powerless against the disease. The plague doctor could not cure a single patient. And yet, cities paid these men well and guarded them jealously, because when death is everywhere, people will pay a fortune for the sight of someone who appears to be doing something. Now, here is the hinge of the whole story, the turn on which everything pivots. For the entire span we have covered so far, from Hippocrates to the plague doctors, the doctor's authority did not rest on results. It could not, because his results were often worse than doing nothing. His authority rested on something else. On learning, on Latin, on titles, on the guild, on the sheer confidence with which he stood at the bedside. And in the very centuries when medicine could do the least good, the profession worked hardest to lock its doors. Physicians organized into royal colleges, secured licenses, and won the legal power to decide who was and was not a real doctor. They pushed out the midwives who had delivered babies for centuries, the wise women who knew the herbs, the folk healers the common people actually relied on. Read that again, because it is the key to the entire profession. The doctor became powerful, organized, and legally protected before he became effective. The monopoly came first, the cure came centuries later. That gap between authority and ability had a victim you rarely hear about, and it was often a woman. For most of history, birth was women's work, handled by midwives with real, hard-won practical skill. As the male physician and surgeon organized and claimed the field, that knowledge was pushed to the margins and sometimes actively criminalized. During the witch trials that swept Europe, the very women who knew the most about herbs, remedies, and childbirth were among those most likely to be accused, because a woman who could heal was a woman with a suspicious, unlicensed power. The rise of the official doctor was not only the story of knowledge advancing, it was also the story of one kind of healer gaining a monopoly by driving another kind out, and it is worth remembering that the winner of that contest was, for a long time, no better at keeping people alive. So why did anyone go along with it? Why did people keep paying, keep trusting, keep baring their arms to the lancet when the treatment so often failed? Part of the answer is that they had nothing else, and a doctor who offered confident action felt better than a shrug. Part of it was the placebo effect, real and powerful. A calm, authoritative figure who takes your case seriously genuinely makes patients feel better. And sometimes the belief in a cure does more than the cure. And part of it was pure theater, the Latin and the instruments and the grave nod, the same performance of certainty that the plague doctor staged in his beaked mask. The doctor survived not because he worked, but because he was needed, and because the ritual of being cared for is, in itself, a kind of medicine. That much, at least, was never fake. The first cracks in Galen's authority came from a fierce, difficult Swiss physician of the early 1500s who called himself Paracelsus. He was so contemptuous of the ancient books that he reportedly burned the works of Galen and Avicenna in public and declared that a doctor should learn from nature and from patients, not from dead men's pages. He was arrogant, quarrelsome, and often wrong, but he was also right about something enormous: that specific minerals and chemicals, given in the right dose, could act as real medicines, and that the dose was everything. His most famous line still echoes through every pharmacy on earth: that the poison is in the dose, that any substance can heal or kill depending on how much you take. He did not overthrow the humors by himself, but he was the first loud voice to insist that the old certainty might simply be wrong, and that a doctor's job was to look, not merely to recite. And then, slowly and against fierce resistance, the doctor finally began to earn the trust he had been demanding for 2,000 years. It did not happen in one moment, but across a few extraordinary centuries. In 1543, a young anatomist named Andreas Vesalius did the unthinkable and dissected human bodies himself, publishing a magnificent, accurate atlas that quietly proved Galen wrong on point after point. In 1628, an English physician named William Harvey worked out that the heart is a pump, and the blood circulates through the body in a closed loop, overturning more than 1,000 years of Galen in a single stroke of careful observation. The theorists of the mind and the practitioners of the hand were, at long last, being forced to look at the same evidence. The 19th century is where the miracle really arrives, and it is a story of both triumph and tragedy. In 1846, in Boston, ether was first used publicly to put a patient to sleep for surgery, and in an instant the screaming horror of the operating room fell silent. For the first time in human history, a surgeon could work on a body that felt nothing. Then came the harder lesson, the invisible one. In 1847, a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed that women whose babies were delivered by doctors died of fever far more often than those delivered by midwives, and he worked out why. The doctors were going straight from dissecting corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands. He ordered them to wash in a chlorine solution, and the deaths collapsed. He had found something that would save millions. And his colleagues, insulted by the suggestion that their own hands were killing their patients, rejected him, drove him out, and left him to die, broken in an asylum. The truth was right, and the profession was not ready to hear it. But the tide could not be held back. In 1854, in London, a physician named John Snow traced a deadly cholera outbreak to a single public water pump on Broad Street, mapping the dead house by house until the pattern pointed straight at the water and had the pump handle removed. He had founded the science of epidemiology in the middle of a plague. Then, in the 1860s, the work of Louis Pasteur and the surgeon Joseph Lister finally revealed the enemy that had been there all along: germs, living organisms too small to see, the true cause of the infection, the fever, and the rot. Lister began cleaning wounds and instruments with antiseptic, and surgical patients who once died routinely began to live. This was the true hinge in the practice of medicine. For the first time, the doctor understood what actually made people sick, and could actually stop it. Historians have made a striking observation about this turning point. For all of recorded history up to somewhere around the year 1900, if you walked into a doctor's office with a random illness, the odds are that you would have been better off staying home because the treatment was as likely to harm you as help you. It was only around the beginning of the 20th century, with anesthesia, antiseptics, germ theory, and the first real drugs, that the balance finally tipped, and a visit to the doctor became, on average, more likely to save your life than to shorten it. Think about that. The profession is thousands of years old, but the doctor who actually helps more than he harms is a little over a century old. Almost everything we mean by modern medicine, the antibiotics, the vaccines, the safe surgery, the scans, is younger than your own great-grandparents. Once medicine could truly cure, the profession moved fast to make sure only the properly trained could practice it. In 1910, in the United States, a report by an educator named Abraham Flexner surveyed the country's medical schools and found many of them to be little more than diploma mills, and it triggered a sweeping reform. Schools were closed, standards were raised, and medicine became the long, rigorous, science-based training we recognize today. The gatekeeping that had once protected an empty authority was now protecting a real and powerful one. The doctor had finally become what he had always claimed to be, a person whose knowledge could reliably save your life, and the licenses and colleges and hard exams at last stood guard over something worth guarding. So what does this profession look like today? And what does it cost to become one? Here are the numbers. In the United States, there are over 1 million practicing physicians. Becoming one means 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and then 3 to 7 years of residency training, so a doctor often does not fully finish training until their early 30s. The financial toll is real. The typical American medical graduate now carries around $200,000 or more in student debt before earning a full salary. On the other side of that gauntlet, the rewards are among the highest of any profession. The average physician in the United States earns well over $300,000 a year, and specialists in fields like surgery and cardiology can earn far more than that. Let one real example make it concrete. Picture an orthopedic surgeon, the kind of doctor who replaces a worn-out knee. A single knee replacement operation, all told, can be billed at somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 once the hospital, the implant, and the surgeon's fee are added together. That surgeon might do several in a week. Behind that number sits a decade and a half of training and a debt the size of a house, but also a simple fact that no medieval physician could have dreamed of. The patient walks out of the hospital and, before long, walks without pain. The money is enormous, but this time, unlike almost every century that came before, the healing is real. The customer actually gets what he is paying for. And yet the old ghost has not entirely left the house. Even now, with all our science, medical error remains one of the leading causes of death in the developed world. Studies in the United States have estimated that mistakes in hospitals, wrong doses, misdiagnoses, hospital-borne infections contribute to a shockingly high number of deaths every year, placing medical error among the top causes of death in the country. The tools have changed beyond recognition. The scalpel is clean, the drugs are tested, the surgeon washes his hands. But the deepest truth of this profession still holds. To be a patient is to place your body in another person's hands and to trust that the person helping you will not, by accident or by arrogance, become the thing that harms you. Washington learned that in 1799. We are still learning it now. So think back to that cold December night, to George Washington propped up in his bed at Mount Vernon, surrounded by the 3 best-trained, most respected, most expensive physicians in the young country, each one of them certain, each one of them doing exactly what 2,000 years of medical authority had taught him to do, and each one of them helping to bleed a strong man to death over a sore throat. They were not fools and they were not villains. They were the end product of the longest-running confidence in human history, the belief that the man with the title and the theory must know how to save you. Healing was never really the point of the doctor. Authority was the product. The trust was the product. For most of history, that trust was sold long before it could be earned, and people paid for it with their blood. That is not an accident. That is the oldest business model there is, and it took 2,000 years and a revolution in science to finally make the promise true. Here is the lesson to carry out of all this. The next time you sit in a waiting room and hand your body over to a stranger in a white coat, remember that the coat is new but the trust is ancient, and that for almost all of human history, that trust ran far ahead of the ability to deserve it. We are lucky, luckier than almost everyone who ever lived, that in our tiny sliver of the story, the doctor can finally back the promise up. Do not take it for granted because it is younger and more fragile than it looks. If this video changed how you look at the person who holds your life in their hands, subscribe, because next we are covering more everyday jobs whose real history nobody ever tells you.